All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you all online with us today for our COVID-19 Workplace Legalities Chamber Live. My name is Kaylee Worski, and I am the event coordinator here at the Chamber of Commerce. Joining us from Weaver Simmons is Zachary Cordomage, who will lead the workshop until 2:45, leaving time for some questions and answers prior to the event end at 3 o'clock. There's just a few items I want to go over before we get started. We will be recording this session today and adding it to our resource section on our website. Due to the increased volume online, should there be any technical difficulties, please note that we appreciate your patience and thank you for rolling with us. There is also a chat box available, which I will be reading from to ask your questions directed to Zachary. Should you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Zachary and I will be happy to provide you with his contact information in a follow-up email along with a survey. Now I'd like to introduce Zachary Cordomage of Weaver Simmons, Sudbury's largest law firm. Zach is a partner at the firm and practices in the firm's labor and employment law group, representing employers throughout the province in wrongful dismissal actions, grievances, occupational health and safety matters, collective bargaining, human rights proceedings, and labor board matters, just to name a few. In this presentation, Zach will speak about how COVID-19 affects the workplace and what steps can and must be taken. I'll now turn it over to you, Zachary. Thank you so much.
Can people hear me now? Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. I'll start again. First of all, thank you all for coming. I believe my comment was I was very impressed by such a great turnout, and it's nice to see all of you. I know several names on the list, and hi to those people, and hi to everyone else, of course. I'm sorry it's not under better circumstances. I'm also sorry for the technical issue to start off. Obviously, these are new and challenging times, and we're dealing with a rather novel situation that is changing day by day. What I'm going to try to do in the course of this hour is pack as much information as I can in on all the different things to think about and to know, and then I'll try to allow for some questions at the end. So a quick word, I've already been introduced, so I won't go into that. I always have to start with this. This presentation is intended to provide basic legal information. It isn't in and of itself legal advice, but I'm happy to provide you legal advice for your specific circumstances as they arise. And give me a call or schedule an appointment remotely at this point, of course, and we'll go from there. The other thing I'll note, as I said, is this is a developing situation and some details may change. So again, your mileage may vary, and give me a call if you have any questions. Okay, so quickly, I said I'd cover a bunch of different things. These are those things. I'll talk quickly about COVID and the state of the province, state of emergency in essential workplaces after last week's announcements, protecting your workplace, working from home and the challenges associated with that, the new provisions in the Employment Standards Act, as well as temporary layoffs, various benefits workers and employers might be able to receive, and a little bit about Occupational Health and Safety Act obligations and work refusals, which you may or may not be seeing already. So what is COVID-19? Well, you've been hearing a lot about that, so you probably already have a good idea. It's an infectious disease caused by a newly discovered coronavirus. Typically, older people and those with underlying conditions are more likely to develop serious symptoms. It's mainly respiratory. It's believed to originate in Wuhan, China in about December. It was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11th. I pulled some numbers this morning to see where we were at, and there's a few different websites that are correlating that. The top couple numbers are the global numbers based on, so about 3 o'clock general time, which I think was about 10 this morning, if I'm doing the math right. 885,000 worldwide cases. The Canadian numbers were officially published last I checked at 9:20 this morning. We had 8,536 confirmed cases in Canada and 1,966 in Ontario. Importantly, the numbers are continuing to rise. What I've been watching is how fast they've continued to rise. It seems that we're still in a relatively large percentage growth per day, and we're hoping to see that start to drop off as part of the flattening of the curve. So, as far as the state of Ontario goes, Premier Ford declared a state of emergency, and many municipalities have followed. They have recently extended that state of emergency from the original end date of March 31 for an additional 2 weeks. So we're up to April 13th now. Also, as you know, on March 23rd, all non-essential businesses were ordered to close by midnight for 2 weeks. That state of emergency extending will also apply to that. So state of emergency, just by way of background, is declared under this act you see at the top of the page here, Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. And as part of that state of emergency, there has been a closure of many establishments. I've listed a few here: bars, restaurants, libraries, indoor recreational, theater, concert, child care centers. They've extended that state of emergency to include public events, notably parades, social gatherings, things like that for 5 or more people. There was a partial exemption for funerals where they were allowing up to 10 for a funeral, but that's all part of that order. So right after they made the order to close the business, that night they had published a list of essential workplaces. I've put the link in there of that, and likely many of you have seen that already. It was circulating around social media that night. Broadly speaking, there are a lot of businesses that the government is considering, at least at this stage, to be essential services. I've listed right here for you kind of the basic headers of each of those sectors that are relevant. Now, having said that, for those businesses that were ordered closed, they are allowing, teleworking and online commerce and that sort of thing. So what you're interested in is protecting your workplace. COVID-19 is very infectious, and what they're saying is that it's much more so than SARS was. I remember dealing with SARS many years ago and being very scary. The SARS fatality rate was higher, at least so far, than COVID-19 is, but COVID-19 spreads more easily. So because it spreads more easily, you're hearing a lot of that phrase flattening the curve. And what we're trying to do there, and what the government is trying to do there, is to slowly minimize the growth of cases so as not to overwhelm the healthcare sector and other sectors. It doesn't necessarily reduce the total number of cases we get. What it does is actually prolongs it, but manages the total numbers at any one time. So in order to do that, you're also hearing about social distancing and self-isolation practices. Many of you are probably tuning in from home today. I'm in the office really just to do this presentation, and then I'll be returning home as well. You should in your workplace have some kind of COVID-19 protocol. Likely you've already turned your mind to this to some degree, and you should be outlining certain precautions that you can take or certain adjustments you can take. And one of the benefits of that, very simply, is not only protecting your workers and protecting yourselves, but also what you're doing there is you're demonstrating diligence and you're taking it seriously. If you get cases within your workplace, eventually, if you get situations that escalate this within your personal sector, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate that you've taken the required steps to ensure that your workplace is as safe as possible. So, workplace safety duties. What you should be mindful of is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is, of course, the Ontario legislation that deals with workplace safety and all its attached regulations on various safety measures that you have to take. Specifically, I would refer you to the section that you see here, Section 25, and specifically subsection 2, an employer is obligated to provide information, instruction, and supervision to a worker to protect the health and safety of a worker. And they're also obligated to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. These are, so you're aware, the usually among the sections that are charged where employers face charges under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Typically, there'll be a number of specific regulations depending on what particular incident happened in the workplace, and then one or both of these sections will also be charged under. Specific to COVID, these are your main obligations under that act. So, what I've tried to do is put together a few suggestions for you to take steps to protect your workplace for the workers that are still in it. Limit access to mingling areas. If you have a break room where it's very common for people to be in there in large numbers, likely it's a smaller area, so they're within 6 feet of each other. You want to try to avoid that. Do everything you can to avoid that. And one of the ways to do it might be to either ask people to eat at their desk or to put less chairs in the lunchroom. Okay, another thing you can do, something we've done, is closed our office to visitors. If there are appointments, special arrangements are made. Appointments are done in a particular room, and it's cleaned before and after each appointment. And I'd encourage you to look at protocols like that. Where you can, take appointments electronically. And fortunately, the more and more resources we have, such as programs like this, the easier that is to do. Another thing you can do is educate your workforce about hygiene. That might include putting notices up around the office indicating that people should be washing their hands and that sort of thing. And any other steps you can do to decrease worker density. That could include people working from home. It could include rearranging the physical workplace. A couple more things, obligatory hand sanitizer stations. It's another thing I've seen done by several employers. So as soon as employees or anyone comes into the office, they're asked to use the hand sanitizer right away. Again, working from home. Rotating schedules for in-office work is another option. Some places simply can't have everyone working from home, but to decrease density, what you can do in theory is to have one group working one week and one group working another week. You should probably be talking to your employees about about travel if they've been out of the country recently or otherwise. I'll just pause. I think we have a sound issue. All right, sorry about that, guys. I think I was talking about requesting detail of employee travel. If you have employees that have been traveling either for work or personally, that's something you should be aware of. Now with the implication of the Quarantine Act at the federal level, people that are returning from out of country are expected to be self-isolating as a requirement. Now that that's in place, that's fortunately an issue that will be dealt with automatically. However, employee travel for work should also be reduced or eliminated at this time. Educate your workers regarding social distancing. If you can have have an email go around or have a discussion of some sort, and that's something that you can educate your workforce on as far as working in the office and outside the office, because of course if anyone gets ill, then you're going to be potentially having that come into the workplace, and you want to minimize that as well. So working from home is something that many workplaces are turning to already, and like I said, many of you are likely doing that now. It works good for many things. It's an opportunity for continuing your operations, but also minimizing exposure in and through the workplace of anyone who might be experiencing symptoms. It does, however, create some challenges of its own, specifically around effectively controlling and directing your workforce. Obviously, if somebody's not right down the hall from you, you can't go over and give them directions, and so getting a hold of them is a little bit more of a process. Um, as well, the viability of working from home may differ. Some offices can work almost entirely from home, some can't at all, and some you need to have at least a skeleton crew in the office. And that's where you can look at those rotating shifts I was talking about. Productivity levels when working from home is often the issue we're seeing. So um, if you're allowing your employees or some of your employees to work from home, you want to make sure you're getting value for dollar on that. They are on paid time while they're there, and so you should be doing what you can to make sure that the productivity levels are being monitored. There's a few different ways you can look at that. One is making sure your employees understand that they should be ready and available to perform duties during business hours. You can also consider having policies and practices in place surrounding monitoring that, giving employees very measurable duties to perform, and things like that. So here I've given a few examples on this slide for monitoring. Requiring detailed timesheets on a day-by-day basis from employees is going to be an option. Doing regular morning teleconferences. That way you're making sure your people are out of bed and in front of the computer first thing in the morning. That gives you an opportunity to touch base, make sure everything that had to happen yesterday, and make sure everyone knows what has to happen today. Doing things like that to structure your employees' days will help. And again, I mentioned assigning tasks that have measurable outcomes as much as possible. Consider also your IT needs, which may need to be changed. If you have a lot of people working from home, those people might need access to remote desktop or similar software that they either didn't have before or you have a limited amount of licenses for. You may need to look at whether you need more of that. As well, whether some employees have access to computers that can be moved from their office to their home, and be mindful of various IT security and antivirus issues. We have been hearing that as a result of people working from home, there is more email scamming going on. Be very mindful of emails from purported to be from a boss or a manager that aren't, and let your employees know to be mindful of that. So consider beefing up those resources and policies and knowledge regarding cybersecurity and internet use. You probably do not want your employees using a work computer that they've taken home for personal business, much like at work, and that should probably be clarified with them. So as I said, not every job can be done 100% from home. So one of your ways to consider that is interchanging weeks with a split workforce, or some other arrangements to both have your office running while minimizing workplace exposure risks. Ensure, of course, that if you're making those arrangements that it's functionally doable. And what I mean by that is that having no one in your accounting department on 1 week and both of them in the second week is obviously not going to work. So it's worth having those contingency plans in place to know how alternative shifts can be arranged so that the business continues to move. Okay, so many of you are likely aware that the government met to introduce emergency legislation on a couple points, and one of them was Employment Standards Act provisions. So the government has introduced very quickly an infectious disease emergency leave, and that's available to employees under several different circumstances. If they're not able to perform duties for reason of personal illness, of quarantine, of concern by the employer that an employee may expose others and so are being asked to stay home, or to provide care and support to family members or some other travel-related restriction, those employees have a job-protected leave. Okay, when they introduced that leave, they made it retroactive to January 25th, which was the date that the first case was confirmed in Ontario. Again, it is a job-protected leave. You're not able to terminate for any of those reasons we listed earlier. Employers can also not require medical notes for those reasons. So you're seeing that restriction again, much like the Kathleen Wynne personal emergency leave provisions that have since been repealed. And similarly, you can ask for what they call evidence reasonable in the circumstances. That's always debatable what that means, but something other than a medical note that verifies that there is a legitimate reason for them to need the leave that they're asking for. I suggest to you that you might want to consider a flexible approach to that. And what I mean by that is that you might want to give some benefit of the doubt to your employees. This is a leave without pay. It's simply a job protected leave for these purposes. You don't want to be insisting employees who might be infected enter your workplace if you don't need to. There's a public interest right now against that unnecessary contact. Okay. So one of the reasons for that leave is to care for another person. The new sections of the Act specify who those people would be and who that would apply to. And there's a rather long list. And again, I would find it analogous to the personal emergency leave provisions that used to exist. I've listed a number of them out here. If it relates to the employee's spouse, parent, child, sibling, grandparent, grandchild, brother, sister-in-law, uncle or aunt, niece or nephew, really any of those people, and that person needs to be available to care for them, they're going to be entitled to that leave. As far as the length of the leave goes, this is what the new section says, and it's section 50.1 if anyone wants to review it. An employee is entitled to take a leave for as long as he or she is not performing the duties of his or her position because of an emergency declared. But that entitlement ends when the emergency is terminated or disallowed, or if the circumstances that require them to take that leave change. Be mindful, of course, that there are other leaves that may apply to the circumstances of your employees. The new leave will likely encompass most situations you'll face. However, there are still job-protected leaves in the Act for sick leave, family responsibility leave, bereavement leave, which are the new Ford government substitutions for the personal emergency leave under Kathleen Wynne, as well as critical illness leave and family caregiver leave, which already exist under the Act. Okay. So the other thing you should be mindful of are temporary layoffs. Okay, a temporary layoff is a situation where you don't have enough work to support your workforce, and so you're asking some people to be laid off. That is, of course, a without pay situation, and it is not a termination of employment for the purposes of the Employment Standards Act. The Act permits temporary layoffs up to 13 weeks in a 20-week period. So think 13 weeks straight, but if they come back in the middle for 2 weeks and then leave again, a 20-week overall period. That can be longer. That can actually be 35 weeks in a 52-week period, subject to certain conditions. So one is if you're continuing an employee's benefits and pension, you're allowed to sustain that layoff for a longer period of time, but make sure you know the specifics of that. Okay, I've just included the section here for reference. 56.1, an employer terminates the employment of an employee for the purpose of Section 54 if the employer lays the employee off for a period longer than the period of a temporary layoff. So what this means is if you go past that 13 week in the 20-week period, you will have deemed to have terminated the employee. And at that point, for the purposes of the Act, termination and severance pay are going to be owing. So you want to be mindful of that. If you're taking advantage of temporary layoff provisions under the Act, you need to watch how long you're allowing those to continue and whether you're eligible for that extended period of time we talked about. This is just, again, the section that speaks to those timelines that I've indicated to you. Layoff of not more than 13 weeks in any period of 20 consecutive weeks, or 35 and 52 with those conditions. Okay. If any of you are federal employers and subject instead to the Canada Labour Code, the Canada Labour Code also permits temporary layoffs up to 3 months or more than 3 months under certain conditions, which are similar to the Employment Standards Act ones. So you'll have the same opportunity there where there's a shortage of work to take advantage of the provisions under the Act without terminating your workforce. If you're going to take advantage of temporary layoff provisions, you need to. There's a few things you should be mindful of. Okay, one is employee morale. Obviously, your employees are as stressed as you are in these circumstances, and they're worried about their jobs. So I'd suggest that if this be done, it be done as cautiously as possible, and you should consider who it is that you're choosing for a temporary layoff. Employees with 30 years experience are going to be upset if they're laid off ahead of employees that were hired this year. And that's something you want to be mindful of. Now, of course, you also have to consider operational needs and how many people you need in each department. Length of service, I've noted. Consider what total numbers you need, and consider whether you have contract provisions in a written employment contract with those employees that might play into this. So I wanted to address quickly here the idea of paid leave or time off with pay. Um, Obviously, the circumstances you're facing now as employers are not your fault. What we're dealing with is a worldwide pandemic. It's a societal issue. It's not an issue of employers. It doesn't fall at the feet of employers. Many businesses are closed due to government order or simply because things are too slow with social distancing practices. Okay, all of these are really outside the employer's control. So typically, and my point is this, there's no obligation to pay wages if work isn't being performed, typically. And an employer is generally not obligated to make the employee whole in these sorts of circumstances. You will potentially face situations where your employees are home without pay for a period of time. What I suggest you do is, because we're all in this together, is do what you can to assist those employees, to reassure them that they will be coming back, to help them with employment insurance if you can, and all that sort of thing. Okay. I also want to deal with EI and other benefits. I'm going to go through this one a little more quickly. You're dealing with a number of different potential eligibility areas for employees that are displaced as a result of COVID-19, and I want to touch upon each of them. So workers who are displaced from work may be eligible for about 4 or 5 different types of benefits. And as I've noted, employers should assist where possible to help their displaced workers. And remember your obligations amongst all the chaos to complete records of employment. I encourage you to do it as quickly as you can so that your employees can access support as quickly as they can. Regular EI benefits are available to employees who lose their jobs without fault and can't find work. They're generally eligible if they were employed in insurable employment and they're ready, willing, and capable to work, and have worked the required number of hours during the insurable period, which is typically between 420 and 700 hours. The qualifying period is typically the last 52 weeks since the start of the claim, or if they've been on EI more recently than that, the period of time in between. If they are successful in obtaining regular EI benefits, they'll receive 55% of weekly earnings up to $573 a week. Okay, sickness benefits are also available. And these are available to employees who can't work for medical reasons, including sickness and quarantine. And obviously that's going to be relevant to some people. Generally, people are eligible if their regular weekly earnings are decreased by more than 40%, and they have 600 insurable hours of work. Those claiming benefits due to quarantine are typically being excused from a medical note requirement at this time. And I apologize for the cutoff of the last line there, but again, if employees are eligible, 55% of earnings up to $573 a week. So there's also caregiving benefits, and that may apply to some people. That's available to employees taking time off to provide either care or support of some sort to a critically ill person or someone needing end-of-life care. And there's 3 different subcategories of that: family caregiver benefit to children, family caregiver benefit for adults, or compassionate care benefits. Caregivers must be like family to the ill person, and if successful, you could be eligible for caregiving benefits for between 15 and 35 weeks, depending on which type of leave of those 3 subcategories you fit within. And the amounts are the same, 55% of earnings up to $573 a week. So there are circumstances where it's possible to receive some pay while on EI benefits. So just to be mindful of that. The general rule under the current structure is that half of every dollar earned gets deducted from EI benefits up until you're earning 90% of your previous earnings. It is also possible to opt for the old system of calculation, which allows somebody to earn up to 40% of benefit without deduction, which typically works out to about a day's work per week. If a full week is worked, they're not going to be entitled to those benefits, though. So if you have employees asking questions about this, what you may want to do is direct them to look into this. That old system has to be opted into. And so if employees are getting regular EI benefits, they should consider which works best for them. And if you have some work available to them, that maybe they can fit within that. There's also a work sharing program through the federal government. And that works, broadly speaking, where an employee receives EI benefits as income support, where there's reductions of 10 to 60%. Affected employees have to agree to work a reduced schedule and to share available work over a period of time. This is something that has to be, to get this, the employer and the employees have to apply together, and the employer will have to submit a recovery plan. And you'll have to go through that with EI and get that set up as a framework, as a regime. If that's something that may apply to you, you may wish to look into this. Finally, the new one is this, Canada Emergency Response Benefit. This is being fast-tracked, and so some advice that I'm reading is that employees that aren't already on regular EI benefits might want to go straight to this because they seem to be processing them faster. So this allows up to $2,000 a month, but you need 14 days without income to qualify. And it's the eligibility is a little bit broader. Workers who must stop working and do not have access to paid leave or other support will be eligible. Sick, quarantined, or workers taking care of someone. Working parents needing to stay home to care for a child because the child care schools are closed. Workers still employed but not receiving pay, so that's the temporary layoff, due to closures or the employer asking them not to attend work because they're experiencing symptoms. Self-employed individuals not eligible for EI will also likely be eligible for this. So finally, in the last few days, the federal government has been discussing a wage subsidy for employers. Not all the details are rolled out on this. I looked at this as recently as this morning to see what update I can get, and this is what I have at the moment. Eligible employers may be able to receive up to a 75% wage subsidy, retroactive to March 15th. So what they're saying right now is that it's only going to cover up to the first $58,700 of salary, which works out to about $847 a week as a maximum. Employers to be eligible have to demonstrate that they've suffered a 30% decline in revenue. The specifics of how you might show that are not yet available, but this is what's coming down the pipe. So this is an attempt to keep people in work. If you have work available for employees, you may be eligible to get this and to keep people rolling without as much of an income stream. Okay. Another area to consider is the Occupational Health and Safety Act work refusals. A worker generally has the right under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to refuse work where they have reason to believe the work is unsafe. And that typically falls into one of these categories that I've listed out here. Equipment they're using is likely to endanger themselves or someone else, the physical condition of the workplace, workplace violence, or equipment the worker uses or the physical condition contravenes health and safety legislation and is likely to endanger someone. For the purposes of COVID, most of those don't really fit. The second one, however, the physical condition of the workplace is likely to endanger him or herself, is the one where you're most likely to see that. So I don't know if anyone's received a work refusal yet. Likely you have had employees say, I'm not sure I feel safe at work, or I don't know if I want to come in, can I do something else? What you may see is I'm refusing to work here because it's a risk. If the work refusal process under the Act is engaged, there's a few things you have to be mindful of. So there's a process mandated under the Act, and what I've done is I've tried to outline here kind of the step-by-step of this. If this happens to you, you may wish to seek advice and you may wish to ensure you're going through all the proper protocols. The worker has to promptly report their refusal, and when they do, the employer has an obligation to investigate it. So the worker is put in a safe place. They're expected to be available for the purpose of that investigation, and the employer will investigate with a health and safety representative to see if there is in fact a risk in that workspace and what they can do to mitigate it or to eliminate it, excuse me. Once the employer resolves that work refusal, the employee is expected to return to work. If the employee does not believe that that resolution was actually effective, and they have reasonable grounds to believe the work is still unsafe, that will escalate the matter to the Ministry of Labor. At that point, the Ministry of Labor is called in to do their own investigation. Hopefully, it doesn't get to that point. Things to note: employers can't impose a penalty, threaten to impose a penalty, or intimidate a worker for exercising their rights under this act. But these protections don't apply if a work refusal is not motivated by a genuine belief that the work is unsafe. So ultimately, if the ministry decides that the worker can safely return and it's gone all the way through that process, and the worker still doesn't want to work, you've been covered. You've done the whole steps. You've determined that there's nothing further to be done. Unlikely that most work refusals would be a legitimate employee action if reasonable precautions have already been taken as it pertains to COVID. You are going to have workers who are nervous about the workplace. You likely already do. And that's one of the reasons I've indicated earlier that you want to take those diligent steps to ensure that you've put processes in place, because you're going to be able to demonstrate it. You're going to be able to show that, yes, we're aware that there's a chance that there could be infections, and this is what we're doing to make sure that isn't happening. There's also an obligation to report under the Act for something that's considered an occupational illness. If an employer is advised a worker is ill resulting from COVID-19 exposure at work, or if a claim has been filed with WSIB based on COVID exposure at work, you're supposed to notify the Ministry of Labor within 4 days, and you also have to notify your health and safety people and your union if you have one. So keep that in mind. That's going to apply if you start seeing infections within the workplace, or potentially transferred through the workplace. So I've gone into here. This is my attempt to address some of the frequently asked questions, and some different things you can do in different circumstances. So in the next couple slides. Employees returning from travel need to self-isolate. Now that I mentioned this earlier, now that the Quarantine Act has been utilized at the federal level, it's now mandatory. So this is less of an issue for employers to deal with right away. But prior to that, you likely would have had to insist that your employees stay home for 14 days. Again, you will have employees that want to be home or are asking to be home. So consider those needs and the employee preference as best you can. Again, we're all in this together. It is possible for you to accommodate their absence and allow them to take a leave temporarily if it's something that you can do within your operations. This is a circumstance, to be clear, where an employee is not symptomatic or not exposed to someone who's symptomatic. They're just worried. They're afraid that being at work is putting them at risk. Okay. If you have an employee that has childcare arrangement issues because daycares are closed and the schools are closed, family status is a protected ground under the Human Rights Code, and you're obligated to attempt to accommodate family status. So that how you do that is going to vary, and different options might be available to you depending on your workplace. This might be something where you need to accommodate the absence, and it would fit within that new leave under the Employment Standards Act. You should engage in a dialogue with your employee if this comes up. If you have an employee who is showing symptoms, send them home. You're allowed to do that. The Act gives them the protected leave for if they can't come to work because they're showing symptoms. And you don't want that risk in the workplace. That's going to make your other employees not only concerned, but potentially at risk. Send them home and accommodate their absence. If there's a way they can work from home, look into it, but you need to get them out of the workplace because they're a risk to the health and safety of your other workers. If you have an employee who has advised they've been tested for COVID-19, those people should be self-isolating, waiting the results, and same thing, accommodate the absence and work within that. If you have a confirmed case at work, and hopefully you're not there, and hopefully you'll never be there, you're going to likely need to take some steps here. You're going to want to bring a cleaning group in and sanitize everything. You may have to send people home. You're going to have to monitor for symptoms, and you may have some reporting obligations like we talked about in the last couple slides. I'd suggest you have a contingency plan. If you're running the workplace right now and you suddenly have to stop because there's a case there, or perhaps your manager comes down with symptoms and has to be away, have a plan in place for how to deal with that. So, coming to a conclusion, and it looks like I did okay for time. COVID-19 has, of course, been a major disruptive force in the workplace, the economy, and the rest of everyday life. This is, I believe, the greatest disruption to the day-to-day life of Canadians since World War II, and unfortunately, we don't know when it's gonna come to a final conclusion. Hopefully, the states of emergency remain in place for a minimal amount of time, but continue to watch the numbers and continue to watch news from the government. Workplaces can and should exercise additional precautions and put protocols in place, and I've tried to give you a few ideas of how to do that in the last several slides. Ultimately, dialogue is key. Keep your employees in the know, help them out as best you can, because we're all in this together. So that said, thank you very much for hearing me out. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded, and I'm happy that you were all able to join us today. I believe Kaylee has been triaging some questions for me. If you do have some questions, put it in the chat box and I'll try to answer a few. Kaylee, perhaps, do we want to maybe take a couple minutes and let people do that, and then I'll come back on the camera?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a couple questions already. So
Okay.
one's from Angel. Do you require to keep paying the employee if they refuse to work until the investigation is complete?
So if they do a work refusal and you're doing that initial investigation, they would still be on pay, and they should be put somewhere near and be available. So if there's alternative work for them to be doing, I would put them in the alternative work.
Okay, great. I hope that answers your question, Angel. We have another question from Peter. For the EI CERB, if an employee has applied for EI, do they have to reapply for the CERB after 14 days?
The honest answer, Peter, is I don't know. My understanding is that they're attempting to triage these cases as quickly as they can, and I think to have applications try to be done kind of all at the same time and through the same source. If your employee is asking you that question, I would encourage them to get in touch with EI and get that clarified with them. I know that the CERB is available to apply online, and they can look to do that pretty quickly.
Perfect. We have another question from Terry. If we are reducing hours of work more than 10%, oh, sorry, I just lost the question. If we are reducing hours of work more than 10% in these instances, would it be at risk for a constructive dismissal claim?
I'm sorry, the thing moved on me and I wasn't able to see it.
Oh, perfect. Here we are. If we are reducing hours of work more than 10% in these instances, would we be at risk for a constructive dismissal claim?
Potentially, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. So we talked about temporary layoffs as something you can do under the Act, and I kept saying under the Act. There is case law to suggest that a temporary layoff, if it's not done either with the consent of the employee or in accordance with a contractual entitlement that you have to use it, is arguably constructive dismissal. And what that means is an employee can view that as you effectively terminating their employment or attempting to terminate their employment, and then seek to get severance from you. Normally, that case law would support that kind of constructive dismissal. What I would suggest to you is, given the severity of the current circumstances, I believe the courts might be a bit more lenient towards employers in this. It's also, frankly, probably in the employee's interest to accept the layoff at this point, because there's not really any other work for them to be doing. But that is another reason why you may wish if you're going to do layoffs, to start with some of your more junior employees, people with less length of service.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Cheryl. We have a sub plan in place with EI and would like employees to use this. If they apply for EI and are transferred to the SERB, how are we going to top their wages?
That's also a good question. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to give you a good answer, Cheryl. Um, my understanding is that SERB is not going to allow the same kind of top up for wages that regular EI benefits will. It's probably going to be in the employee's interest to go through the regular benefit process and to go through you. If they decide to go through SERB, they might be forfeiting the ability to do that. I would encourage them to speak to EI about those options, and you may wish to do so as well. Sorry, I can't be more specific help on that. SERB is just developing now.
Perfect, thank you. And we have another question. Is there anything to stop public sector employees, governments, boards, and agencies from laying off their non-essential employees?
Sorry, I'm just looking for the question here.
Uh, that one is in a separate chat box.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, read it to me one more time then.
Is there anything to stop public sector employers, government boards, and agencies from laying off their non-essential employees?
Not to my knowledge, unless they fit within like an emergency essential service, if those people are needed for that. Likely, if you're in that kind of environment, your employees are operating under a collective agreement with a public sector union. I would be looking at your layoff provisions under that.
Okay. Megan asks, if we have an employee who informs us they have COVID, are all employees in the workplace allowed to know the name of the staff member, or is this to be kept confidential?
I'd be inclined to not necessarily expose that name to everyone in the staff, but you do need to take steps to make sure that people that potentially are exposed are self-isolating and that sort of thing. So I would keep that to a minimum. Typically, when it comes to medical matters, it's private, and the employer is typically not even entitled to a diagnosis. Um, what you might be content to do is to just advise that you have a reason to believe there may be a case in the office, and then to take those steps from there.
Thank you. We have another question from Helen. In the event some PPE is not available, for example, masks, but you are servicing essential workers, example, janitorial staff, cleaning homeless shelters, and you provide all other PPE and other precautions, are you as the employer taking every necessary precaution?
That's a very good question. Under the current circumstances, I know there's a shortage of many of those kind of items, or there will be a shortage in the near future. Um, I would encourage you to have a dialogue with your workers about this. I would encourage you to supply everything you can, and the best alternative for anything you can't. If an employee, excuse me, is going to refuse work under the circumstances, then you'll have to deal with it as a work refusal. But supply everything you can, and go from there.
Thank you. We have another question from Christine. If an employee is showing symptoms and is self-isolating, are employers mandated to pay the employee during the sick time off, or would we use the employee's vacation time?
So if they're showing symptoms and they're self-isolating, I would interpret that as a sick leave. If they have sick benefits through their employer, they can probably access those. Otherwise, you're looking at EI sick benefits. Ultimately, they're not available for work with you, and so they're probably not being paid. If they want to use vacation time, I think that's within your discretion. That might be the easiest way to continue their employment, and if that's something you can accommodate and they want to do that, I think this is the kind of circumstances where you want to try to be as accommodating as you can about that sort of thing.
Thank you. It doesn't look like there's any other questions coming through. Thank you, Zach, for this great presentation. And thank you all for joining us today during these unprecedented times. Please check out our other upcoming Chamber Live sessions on our website and stay tuned for a survey in your inbox shortly, along with Zachary's contact information. And again, this session will be on our website under the resource section. And I will definitely send you all a link so you have access to this. And thank you again for joining us today. Please enjoy this beautiful day, and I hope that you all stay safe and healthy. And thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think Kaylee's going to distribute my email and contact information. I'm more than happy to take any further questions there if need be. Thanks all for joining in as well from me, and all the best to you.
Thanks.